Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this talk. The talk we're going to mention, as Stephen said, is about some of the lesser known refugees, Jewish refugees escaping from Nazi Europe who came to Northern Ireland, and about their journeys, early lives, and their contribution to the community. So just as a bit of background, we'll go through a timeline. Set the context. So in 1933, January, the Nazis came to power. 1937, the new Industries Development Act in Northern Ireland was passed, and this was nothing to do with the World War or anything. It empowered the Ministry of Commerce to provide grants and loans to applicants to establish businesses, essentially to provide local employment. There was dire unemployment in Northern Ireland at the time. Moving on a bit, 1938, the 12th of March, there was the Anschluss, where essentially Germany unionized, became part of, took over Austria, and Austria was obviously a willing companion. And at this stage, really, persecution of the Jews and other minorities ramped up. There was businesses were confiscated, people were dismissed from their jobs. There was all sorts of persecution. And thousands of Austrian Jews at this time wanted exit permits to get out. The Germans were also forcing them out as well via this immigration department. We'll talk about a bit that later. 1938, the 26th of August, this rather strange advert went out in in a Viennese newspaper about Jewish artisans wanted for Northern Ireland, and this gave rise to a flood of letters coming to the Ministry of Commerce in Northern Ireland about people wanting permits to come and work there. And again, the whole of that story is covered in a book by Noel Russell, which he spoke on earlier in the week at the Linen Hall Library. 1938 in October, Germany annexed the Sudetenland, which is part of Czechoslovakia, again giving rise to a big amount of refugees trying to get out. People knew what direction things were heading in. 1938 November was the infamous Kristallnacht, where Jews, synagogues were attacked throughout Germany, Austria, and Sudetenland. 1939 in April, the first Kindertransport arrived in Belfast. These were refugee children who came over, again, before the war had started, but things were very obvious what was going to happen. 1939, invasion of Poland, the start of World War II. And also UK internment tribunals were set up. Then we'll talk about these quite a bit as we go through. This was phase one of the tribunal system, looking at internments. And then there was a second phase in May and June in the following year, 1940. This is when actually the war was looking quite serious as far as England was concerned. There's a retreat from Dunkirk. And there was a second phase of tribunals set up with mass internments were envisaged. So just talking a little bit more about internment, at the outbreak of the war, tribunals were established to classify so-called aliens into three categories. Category A, if you were considered a threat to national security, so you were immediately interned as an enemy alien in the various prisons. I think Crumlin Road was one. You could be a suspect, category 2, and there was various prohibitions, impositions, and could be imposed. You maybe had a curfew imposed on you. You weren't allowed to own a bicycle, a camera, binoculars. Some people weren't allowed to live near the coast. And then category C, you weren't not considered a threat to security. This is basically refugees from Nazi persecution with the obvious ones and no restrictions. The main decision factor was whether the individual was likely to be a national security risk or not. But in May 1940, so this internment program, the first phase was carried out. But in May 1940, with the real threat of German invasion, it went one phase more serious. Mass internment was planned for all the foreigners, no matter what their previous category was. And Churchill acknowledged, I know there are many people affected by these orders who are passionate enemies of Nazi Germany. I'm very sorry for them, but we cannot at this time and under the present stress draw all the distinctions which we would like to do. And so internment camps were set up. The largest was on the Isle of Man, and there was also huge deportations of internees to Canada and Australia. But in some circumstances, some Category C aliens could apply for release from potential internment if they could fill roles helpful to the war effort, such as doctors, agricultural workers. We'll see an example of this later on, joining the Auxiliary Military Pioneer Corps and so on. Following a huge backlash, especially after the torpedoing of one of the deportation ships, when a large number of Jewish refugees and also German Italians who had been long-time resident in the UK and shouldn't have been any sort of suspect at all, they were drowned. And the internment rules were relaxed later that year. There was quite an uproar in Parliament and articles all over the place. But still, many were still interned in camps for several years. The Isle of Man was one example, and several thousand others had been deported. Anyhow, we'll look at the stories of 4 people: Felicitas Lewinter, Austrian concert pianist; Emil Singer, an Austrian textile industrialist; Heinz Hammerschlag came from Czechoslovakia. He was a textile industrialist and musician; and Oskar Rudnitzky, who was German, a farm laborer, a teacher, a businessman, and a musician. Quite an interesting combination. And the information has come from the PRONI archives and various other research sources. And on the right there's just showing one of the folders from PRONI archives for Heinz Hammerschlag. I mean, it's interesting just looking at the stuff on the cover, closed to the public until 2046. Just get me pointer here. I mean, obviously it's been open since then, and these are the PRONI reference numbers which will be referred to as we go through the talk. And there's a huge amount of information there. There's loads of stuff that's still to be opened and researched and looked at. Anyhow, Felicitas, concert pianist and music teacher, she was born in 1911 in Romania. And the family, the Lewinter sisters, Annie, Charlotte, and Felicitas, moved to Vienna, where Annie started a couture knitwear business. Her sister Charlotte was chief designer. Annie married another Romanian, Zoltan Frankel, who was also in the textile business in 1924. Vienna was a huge center of textiles. And by 1930, the couple had a large-scale knitwear factory. They were exporting and some outlets. And meanwhile, Felicitas was getting a reputation as a concert pianist. And here she is in 1933, aged 22. So she was some sort of child protege, obviously. She attended the Academy of Music aged 10. She was tutored by Emil von Sauer, who had been a pupil of Franz Liszt, whose picture has come up a bit prematurely beforehand, but quite an interesting little character. So a very interesting link between her and one of the most famous pianists, the composers that there's been. Age 13, her concert debut was Beethoven's Piano Concerto. And here's from a local newspaper at the time in 1933, just one of her broadcasts on radio. But her musical career ended abruptly after the Anschluss in 1938, when there was the whole persecution started or took off the ground. Just talking a bit more about what was happening in Vienna at the time, there was a Jewish emigration office which was taken over under the Nazis. It opened in 1938 in its new guise, where the Germans were really wanting the Jews to get out of Italy, out of Vienna, Austria, and meanwhile, properties were being confiscated. There was wholesale persecution going on. And Jews who wanted exit permits had to complete this very detailed immigration questionnaire at the welfare center. It was quite tricky to get out, to get an exit permit. And as of January 1939, there was about 43,000 applicants recorded, which covered about 75,000 relatives. The immigration questionnaire itself was very complicated, asking about earnings, economic situation, language skills, where they wanted to go to, did they have references, and so on and so forth. Anyhow, the Zoltan Lewinter family hoped to go to Australia, evidently, where they had contacts, and they applied for their immigration permits. It's just to look at the form, give you some idea of the forms that were around at the time. This is Zoltan Frankel. He was the main, the leading person for this application. And here you can see the Annie Frankel, Charlotte Lewinter, and Felicia Lewinter as part of the form. It's a very neat form, all typewritten. Most of them were handwritten. Anyway, they got to London, were on the way to Australia, and there they were courted by the Northern Ireland government to open a woolen garments factory in Newtownards, again with the help of government grants and loans. Newtownards at the time had large-scale unemployment, but lots of local skills and hand weaving and embroidery. So the family settled in Belfast. They found out after the war that Annie's parents had been murdered in the Holocaust. Anyway, by 1949, the factory they started, Annie Lewinter Limited, employed about 200 people and exported woolens worldwide. And Annie's husband, Zoltan Frankel, was a leading patron of the arts in Northern Ireland. He supported lots of artists and many studios. And here's an advert from 1947 in an Australian newspaper for Annie Lewinter knitted wear. So again, it just shows the breadth of their export. Here we have Annie Lewinter, world-renowned designer, late of Vienna. Just a bit more about the Lewinter family, because they are very prominent in the sort of history of the Jewish refugees who came to Northern Ireland. They were famous for their knitwear. That's some labels there at the side. There's a blue plaque covering Zoltan and Annie and the 93 Malone Road where they lived. And the name sort of lives on at the Strangford Arms Hotel, the name of the restaurant in the hotel. I'm sure there's very few people who realize the significance of it, but this was the site of the actual Annie Lewinter factory. Anyhow, a bit more about the internal tribunals, which all these refugees were going through as they came into Northern Ireland. This is for Felicia, or Felicitas as her full name was. So the sat before the tribunal, these are the exemption from internments. So here we have Felicia. She was born in Romania.
PRONI, you've muted yourself.
He doesn't know.
PRONI, yeah.
Yes, okay. There's a thing that come up that said I've been muted automatically, so perhaps if anyone could sort that out, I don't know. Oh, okay, hopefully that will be, you can hear me now, yeah?
Yes, hear you now.
Okay, so the notes, Jewish refugee born in Romania, Nazi seized the property, hostile to Germany, intends to apply for naturalization. This is her exemption from internment form and covering notes that went with it from November 1939. So basically saying she's exempt from any restrictions and can sort of live life as normal. She quickly made a mark on the classical music scene in Belfast with regular concerts and radio broadcasts. The first one in 1939, so just the following year after she came over already, she was performing. 1940, there was a concert to be in Belfast. Some tickets available for Crimbles or Heart and Church. So I remember Crimbles was still going when I was a teenager. Radio broadcast, Radio Era, Radio Athlone. For some reason, there was no British broadcasting. All the broadcasts during the war were done via the South, so I don't know if there's any specific reason for that. Again, some more concerts, December 1944 at Queen's. 45, there was a Free Austrian concert where she performed with Heinz Hammerschlag, if you note, another person we're going to talk about. The Wellington Hall, she was giving piano lessons, and again, she was broadcasting. This was after the war, and this was on the Northern Ireland Home Service. She moved to London early 1950, and again advertised as a piano tutor, and this is giving us full pedigree of her background. She was very friendly with the well-known Belfast artist Raymond Piper, who I hope some of you may have heard of. He was well known, especially for his paintings of botanical plants and flowers. And they got on very well together. He did a painting of her, that's one we can see here, and also a pencil drawing of her. So there's this sort of combination of art, music, painting. She commuted frequently between Belfast and London, broadcasting. She gave concerts throughout Northern Ireland, England and overseas, and also continued her piano tuition. Excuse me. And the Belfast newsletter in 1963 noted that her pupils came to her from all over the world. Far East, Ceylon, Malaya. Malaya actually became Malaysia later on in 1963, just out of interest. And she has pupils from various foreign embassies in London. And the Belfast-born piano conductor, Barry Douglas, who's a fellow of the Royal College of Music and a visiting professor there at the moment, he credits Felicitas with inspiring him at the age of 16 to focus on the piano. He said she was an incredible woman. She gave me 20 free lessons and showed me the amazing world of piano and music. And she brought a different term of reference to the history of piano and music because of her link back to Franz Liszt, obviously a very fascinating connection. She died in a nursing home in 1997 in Fulham. This appeared in the Jewish Chronicle in 2002, that the Jewish Youth Orchestra had been given a piano donated by her sister, Charlotte, a Bossendorfer Grand, which belonged to Felicitas. And I tried to trace this piano to see if it was still around anywhere, but I couldn't get any answer from anyone, so hopefully it is still around. Anyhow, here's a picture of a Bossendorfer piano, it's the best I can do, but to give some idea of what the grand piano would have actually looked like. Anyhow, that's the story of Felicitas. She wasn't in Belfast for that long, maybe 15 years, but in that time, she made quite an impact on the classical music scene. Next person we'll talk about, to the textile industry, Emil Singer. Again, from Vienna, Austria, born in 1907. Don't know much about his early days. He was born in Vienna. He married in 1938 Hilde Mannes in a synagogue in Vienna, which was actually destroyed during the Kristallnacht. The Anschluss was March 1938. We don't know exactly the date of the wedding, but it was more likely before then. Again, the emigration application to try and get out for Emil, his wife, and his mother in May 14th, 1938. So he was definitely married by then. And one of the questions they asked were specializations, and that he was a trained knitter, he was a weaver, a year in Textile Academy, 5 years advanced training school. Obviously knew a lot about the textile industry. Anyhow, he ended up in Belfast. I'll say in a couple of minutes probably how, and started up a company, the Ulster Viennese Fabrics Ltd, in 1939 in Adelaide Street at the back of the City Hall. Weavers and manufacturers of dress fabrics, costumes and knitwear, wholesale drapers and so on. And the directors were two people from the Giotto family, I'm not sure of the pronunciation, and then Emil Singer himself, who was living at Kansas Avenue at the time, not far from Fort William. There was the well-known company in Randlstown, the Old Beach Linen Company, which produced fine linens, which employed over 1,200 people at its height between the 1930s and 1940s, 50s. James Giotto was chairman of this company. Charles and Claude were his brothers. So it looks like there was a strong connection between Emil Singer and this company before he actually came over to Belfast. And maybe they acted as referees for him, and maybe they did business even together before the war. I can't say that's definite, but it does look like that way. And here's just the articles when the company was set up. The directors, Charles and Claude Giotto, and then Emil Singer as well. Again, this is from the PRONI archives. The internment, again, the exemption from internment form. This was November 1939, already owner of Network Factory, managing director of the factory, employer Ulster Viennese Fabrics in Adelaide Street. So in the short period of time, 1938 to 1939, the factory had been up and running, and one thinks that he must have had quite a bit of help in getting it off the ground. It seems that he was interned again after the phase 2 internments in 1940, and then re-released in 1941. Seems a bit strange because he seemed to be active in business at that time, but it may have been some sort of compromise they came to, that he could work by being nominally interned. Anyhow, the company itself in Northern Whig in 1940 reported that Jersey Knitwear Fabrics, formerly a Viennese industry, are now manufactured in Belfast. Some of the production is for high-class London trade, and the firm is Ulster Viennese Fabrics Ltd. The present output is about 1,500 yards per week. And a few photographs here. There's obviously some pretty heavy-duty industrial machinery. And this is it's called a circular knitting machine, which evidently was sort of very leading edge at the time. It's quite interesting that the Jersey Knitwear Fabrics, formerly a Viennese industry, I always thought they started off in Jersey, but I'm sure there's a whole history behind that. So later on in 1945, the Banbridge Chronicle reported a letter from Emil Singer that he understood the constable was wanting to establish new industries in the area. He was looking to expand. He wanted to employ 200 to 400 workers. It was pretty heavy duty. We produce Viennese dress fabrics on our circular knitting machines. The yarn is, we've got our yarn allocated to us, presumably there's some sort of rationing going on, and looking for a large factory there. So it seems that certainly at the time the company was pretty large and looking to expand. Anyhow, that never worked out. They moved to Linnenhall Street, not far from Adelaide Street, which was again a centre of the textile business at that time. Here's in 1947 they were exhibiting in Earl's Court. You can see all the various representations they had worldwide, manufacturers of exclusive jersey circular knitted material, and so on. So they had an international presence. This is a letterhead again from the PRONI archives, where we can see that the two Giotto brothers are not directors any longer. Emil and now Hilda is a thing. And this was on the top of the letter to the Ministry of Commerce about expediting his naturalization application. This year I've export orders to the value of £28,000, which in today's money would be probably heading towards $750,000 or $1 million, for a total yardage of 35,000 yards. I've sold these goods to representatives abroad. We're able to produce continental goods which have terrific demand. I have been granted an import license for new modern machinery, arriving before the end of the year, more outstanding exclusive materials. And I'd be very grateful if you will recommend my application on account of the export contribution that I'm making in services rendered to the nation. The Northern Whig in 1948 reported that Queen Mary chooses Belfast material. An all-wool material recently shown in London was very much admired by Queen Mary, and she asked for a length to make a dress and full matching coat. Doesn't actually say if she paid for it or not, but I imagine not. The firm which made it was Ulster Viennese Fabrics, one of the new industries brought to this country by refugees from Austria. The material are very high class, and at one time were exported all over the world by Mr. Singer's factory in pre-war Vienna, and the Belfast company has now captured these valuable markets. And with the exception of some continental key workers, all other workers are Ulster folk. This is very important for all these businesses set up by refugees. There was a great stress always showing them that they were providing employment for Northern Ireland. And really this is almost one of the conditions that they were given permits to come over. Anyhow, new machines have been installed. Mr. Singer would like to find a newer and bigger factory to expand. But then a picture of an evening gown made by the company. But then in 1950, there was this sort of seemed to be a strange move to the old Lodge Road in Belfast off the Crumlin Road. This was, in fact, the very Jewish area, perhaps not so much in the 50s, but certainly in the 40s, where a lot of people came there. Certainly my grandparents lived in that area in the 20s and 30s. They relocated there obviously not such a prestigious area. But the Belfast Telegraph 1954 reporting on recent employment figures noted in the knitwear field considerable progress has been made, and specifically mentioned Ulster Viennese fabrics have been rehoused and producing a new range of continental type knitwear. But by 1955, this address in the Old Lodge Road was taken over by Christie's Wallpaper as a warehouse. And from then on, the only record we have of Ulster Viennese fabrics was bargain sales, and the company was soon dissolved afterwards. But this was really symptomatic of a demise of the whole British textile industry in the 1950s. There was competition from synthetics, overseas competition. There was rising costs at home, and only the large companies could remain profitable. And several other companies set up by refugees, Dainty Fits, Tapestry Weavers in Northern Ireland. There was a couple of others as well. Also stopped trading during this period. And the same was happening over in England as well. There was a great shift especially in woolen and linens weren't used anymore. So we don't know very much about Emil. I know he was naturalized in 1947, lived in Kildare Park at that time. His last recorded address was in 1956, still at Kildare Park, but after that, can't find any trace. He may have returned to Vienna and died in 1983. There is an Emil Singer recorded there, but it can't tell if it's exactly the same person. Anyhow, there's someone who came, a refugee from Austria, set up in very short time a very successful textile industry, which was doing well for 10 plus years, but then because of what was happening worldwide, collapsed, and presumably that he left the UK. Again, he may have changed his name. Some people did that as well, which doesn't help finding. So again, carrying on with textile manufacturers, and we come to Heinz Hammerschlag, textile manufacturer and musician, born in 1905 in Czechoslovakia. So again, we know a bit more about his background. His father was a textile manufacturer, and Heinz worked in the business. It took him around Europe quite a lot, seeing the work that was going on there. But also at the same time, he was a highly accomplished violinist and studied at various famous musical centres. He came to Belfast in March 1939, escaping just before the German annexation of the Sudetenland. And he came over with a wide knowledge of textile trade and a great understanding of music. And he was 34 years old at the time, so he wasn't a youngster. He'd already had a settled life, which was sadly torn apart. His parents were imprisoned in Terezin concentration camp, which was close to Prague. They actually survived the war, and Heinz arranged permits for them to join him in Belfast after the war. They came over in 1947. The archive in PRONI shows that there was certainly a great amount of difficulty with arranging these permits. His wife, Hilda, she sadly died in the concentration camp, and his brother died in Auschwitz. So he certainly had a tragic start to his life after the war. And Helen Lewis, a famous Belfast choreographer and dancer, who her grandson talked about a couple of days ago at the Northern Ireland War Memorial. She wrote in her autobiography, I met Hilda by chance in Prague a few days before she was deported on a punishment transport. I was the last person able to tell Heinz of having spoken with her just before the transport. Heinz had escaped earlier. And Helen herself went through concentration camps, and her biography is quite a harrowing read, although thankfully with quite a happy ending when she came to Northern Ireland. So the company Heinz joined was called Glenbroom. It was a subsidiary of Gurwitch Limited, and some of you may remember the Gurwitch stores from the 60s and 70s and long before that as well. They were started up by someone called Nathan Gurwitch, who came over as a refugee in the early 1900s. He was a successful businessman and opened these ladies' drapery stores, starting from virtually nothing. And during the 30s, he was very significant in helping refugees get out of Austria and Germany. He offered them visas and work positions as well. And he also started off, implemented an evacuee centre in called Stuart Hall in County Tyrone, which is another story. Anyhow, it would seem that probably Heinz Hammerschlag had contact with the Glenbroom factory and Gurwitch's before he came over. Anyhow, he was made Heinz was made production manager and head designer of the factory. And a letter from the Ministry of Commerce, again from the PRONI archive, relating to his naturalization, stated that Glenbroom in 1946 employed about 140 operatives, again a significant company. Heinz extensive knowledge of manufacturing, marketing, planning extensive development under Mr. Hammerschlag's direction. He's a man of considerable personal culture and an outstanding amateur violinist, and in this capacity he gave extensive voluntary service to the Department of National Service Entertainment throughout the war, ENSA. And again, here we have an advert from Gurwitch's from 1940, and you can see here the Glenbroom factory coats are being advertised at 2.5 guineas, if anyone remembers guineas, and then here we have something else at 42 shillings. A lot of this is quite nostalgic for someone of my age. And then the Gurwitch Limited sign there, a very prominent company in Belfast and throughout Belfast as well, throughout Northern Ireland as well. Just an example of the sort of forms that Heinz had to fill in. We'll skip over that, but this was to do with naturalization. So he was naturalized in 1946. Again, the London Gazette published monthly for several years after the war, all aliens who'd been naturalized, obviously not just Jews and other nationalities as well. And the date of the oath of allegiance was taken. So here was Heinz living in Bangor at the time. In 1947, he married Alice Berger. She was a Jewish Austrian refugee, an artist who studied at the Vienna Academy of Arts, came to Belfast in 1938, and she became a very well-known abstract artist with exhibitions worldwide. She was closely associated with the Lyric Theatre, designing settings, and many of her paintings are up in the Ulster Museum, as well as many other galleries. She was a close friend of the Austrian refugee choreographer Helen Lewis, who we've mentioned already. They both obviously had a similar background, and they cooperated in various lyric theatre productions. Alice sadly died in 1969. But this is their wedding certificate from 1947, Alice and Heinz. It's interesting in as much as that it took place at 101 Clifton Park Avenue, which again was not far from Old Park Avenue. And it was done in the house of Rabbi Schachter. You can see here J. Schachter, who was the rabbi of Belfast at the time during the war. And obviously he had a lot of input in what happened to refugees when they came over, and the Millal Refuge Farm, and so on. Heinz later joined a company called Beltex Limited, which may have grown out from something called Ulster Wools and Linens, started by another refugee, not quite clear. Anyhow, this was in Flack Street off the Crumlin Road. He joined as factory manager, and again, it was a textile company, ladies and children's wear. And this is a view of the company in Flack Street from the 1950s. There was a Freddie Gilroy, who I remember as a child, well-known bantamweight boxer. He worked there as a cloth examiner, and the Northern Whig in 1956 reported that Mr. Hammerschlag expressed the pride of everyone in the firm at young Gilroy's fine showing at the Melbourne Olympics on his return to work. Here, more of interest, it talks about the 600 girls, again, this is the language of the time, employed there have followed his boxing career with interest. So even allowing for some exaggeration, there was a significant employment in that factory. Anyhow, Heinz was still manager in 1969. The factory was later bombed and used as an underpin. His music, first thing we have is 1942, playing at the so-called International Club at Queen's. 1945, the Free Austrian concert, which we mentioned with Felicitas. So we can see that Felicitas and Heinz knew each other. They were playing together. 1951, again, just an example of another concert. Again, the leader, Heinz Hammerschlag, obviously a very significant figure on the musical scene. He also taught at the Ulster College of Music, close association with the City of Belfast School of Music, where he did tutoring. Belfast Telegraph, many of his pupils became professional musicians, and there's one of them who was highlighted in the Belfast Telegraph in 1978. Now, in 1974, Heinz remarried again. You remember Alice had sadly died in 1969. And he married a recently widowed Joy Foster. She was an internationally known viola player from Cookstown, in fact. And she had first played viola with Heinz in 1942. In fact, her name was mentioned in one of the concert adverts that we saw before. And they were friends over a long period. Heinz was, 70 years old when he remarried, 69 or 70. So again, not a youngster. 1983, he was recognition of services to music of the province. Queen's conferred on him, honestly, a Master of Arts degree. And the Telegraph reported he was a Czechoslovakian refugee who came in 1938, a well-known musician playing regularly as a soloist, and until recently with the Queen's University Orchestra. Although, funnily enough, there was no mention of his work as a textile industrialist at all. Anyhow, he died in 1998. There's a picture of him here at the City of Belfast School of Music. He's described as the part-time string quartet coach, doesn't even get his name mentioned, but that's who he is. And really the obituary in the Guardian, I think, says it all. As a director of a major Belfast clothing firm, he brought an international expertise to local industry and people. He established training courses for young, unskilled labour, which provided employment for many and the hope and reality of a future career. The Northern Ireland arts world admired his expertise and appreciated his ability to cross political and social divides. He enriched the community with his respect for the individual and his willingness to help others in their search for knowledge. And with his love of music and generosity of spirit, he touched the life of his adopted homeland. So really, one can't say anything more than that. Okay, and then finally, the last person we'll look at is Oskar Rudnitzky, the farm labourer, musician, teacher, company director, who was born in Berlin in 1908 in German. The Rudnitzky is one of these names. It's probably the area or town, I think in Moravia, Bohemia, that his family originally came from. There's an area there called Rudnitty, and it seems that families with this name were there. Came to Northern Ireland in 1938, so he was, again, not a youngster, age 30, before the outbreak of the war. He was a lawyer, but was dismissed because of the Nazi anti-Jewish laws. By March 1938, he was engaged as a German language teacher with a private language school. It's interesting that people were still then wanting to learn German as a language, even though it seemed war was looming, or maybe that's why they wanted to learn it. He came over on initially a 6-month permit. So September 1938, he'd actually joined the Faculty of Arts at Queen's University. He was excused from the entrance exam on account of his law degree at the University of Frankfurt. And then they were keeping tracks of him because of permit renewals. The 1938, the police noted that they were satisfied that this alien is well conducted and are unaware of any objection to granting a visa extension. So anyhow, we have this letter, November 1938, Oskar writing to the Ministry of Home Affairs at Stormont, asking for sympathetic consideration of his application for permit renewal. And he says that the number of pupils who he gives German lessons to is sufficient to maintain him. This is one of the conditions, I think, that people were given permits to come to Northern Ireland. And in addition, I've entered the Faculty of Arts at the Queen's University of Belfast. Actually studying classics is what he entered for. He was, and they're excused his entrance examination. So he says, I hope I can remain self-supporting from giving lessons in German, and my extension application may be granted. So it seems to me quite incredible. He's come over, he's been over here for a few months. He's gone into the classics department at Queen's University. I don't know what his English was like, but looking at the letter, it seems totally fluent. So already this signs that, quite an amazing personage. Anyhow, outbreak of war, the usual, I say usual, but obviously it's fairly traumatic for everyone involved in it. Exemption from internment that was granted. Again, is born in Berlin. Note here that his nationality is down as stateless. And I didn't know this before, but in 1933, the German government revoked German citizenship for German Jews and other political opponents, whether they were resident in Germany or in other countries. They were listed as stateless, presumably to make things difficult for anyone abroad with showing what nationality they were, or for even for Germans perhaps wanting to leave the country where they were trying to get to. There may be problems with being stateless, which there were with things. Anyhow, at the time, this was again November 1939. He was part-time teacher at Methodist College at Belfast. It said he wasn't interned, fair enough. He was also a student at Queen's University. Whether exempted from Article 6A or 9A, these were things if, in fact, even though you were Category C, you may be sometimes subject to further restrictions, maybe some sort of curfew or some sort of restriction on having a bicycle or stuff like that. That's what the 6A and 9A articles were. So here again, no, not applicable. Always seems strange, this question at the end, whether you want to be repatriated, yes or no. But anyhow, I guess that the forms may have come from a previous time. So some other notes on his form. That again, the handwriting was quite bad, but it did mention he was a lawyer dismissed owing to anti-Jewish laws. He's forced to get other employment. Hopes to remain in Northern Ireland and become naturalised. And he's studying classics at Queen's University. Anyhow, on the farm. So how did we get to here from Queen's University? There was an interview with him. He wrote in the Belfast newsletter in 1982 that the government wanted to intern me as a person of no nationality, but said no action would be taken if I worked on a farm at Portaferry. I milked 12 cows every morning there, cleaned out the pigsties, and after a few months, the regulations were changed and I was allowed to return to Queen's University. So what is this? This looks to be, it must be the second phase of internment, when mass internment was threatened against all so-called aliens in May 1940. But if you remember from what we said at the very beginning, sometimes there was let-outs for various classifications. And if you were an agricultural skilled worker, then you could be set to working on a farm somewhere and escape any sort of internment threat. So it looks like the government had actually said to him, there's a choice here, which do you want to do? And obviously he took the farm work. And here, this letter from the PRONI archives, it's Stormont, internal in 1940, September 1940. An enemy alien in Category C named Oskar Rudnitzky, employed by Mr. Campbell Ballycan, Portaferry. And the question arises as to his status as a skilled agricultural worker. And then it says perhaps someone can just go on and check on what's going on here. It says, as to your answer, whether he can be regarded as a skilled agricultural worker depends his internment. So it sounds like that if he couldn't be classified as a skilled agricultural worker, he would be interned. Although he does say here, which would be a pity as he's regarded as a genuine refugee. well, not just a pity, but rather a pity. So anyhow, strangely enough, on the farm, this Ballycam farm in Portaferry, the owners of it, Philip and Mabel Campbell, Mabel wrote a book about her experiences owning a couple of farms in Northern Ireland in 1948. The book was called As Luck Would Have It. It came out in 1948, and in it she notes that about Oskar coming to work there. So what she says, Oskar came to work here in June 1940. So this would have been shortly after the May 1940 internment threat. We had two doubts before he came. Number one, he would not hit it off with the men. He was studying classics at Queen's University, and probably the farmhands were very far removed from that. And when he heard he was a violinist, maybe he would shy away from rough or dirty work. But next day at the sheep dipping, he made an entirely favourable impression on all the men. Anyhow, she goes on to say, he took the responsibility of the farm off my shoulders. He took over the vegetable garden as well. And who says the Jewish people cannot adapt themselves to the land? So indeed a compliment. In autumn 1940, he returned to Queen's University. And in fact, the following summer, she said that he came back there and helped further with the farm. Anyhow, this matches up with November 1940, some letters from Queen's University. I understand arrangements have recently been made for the internment of certain categories of alien students of universities. And then it specifically talks about Oskar. And then another letter here from Queen's, wishing to certify that it is desirable that Mr. Rudnitzky should continue his studies at the university, and in similar circumstances, a British student would be allowed to continue his studies. Anyhow, Oskar graduated in the middle of the war, July 1942. I mean, there was the Blitz in Belfast. Heaven knows what was going on there. He got a first-class honours degree, and the graduation list said a feature of the ceremony was the conferring of degrees on a number of refugees. Among these was an Austrian, Oskar Rudnitzky. 1943, he married Honor Atkinson, and she has a very interesting background, which she was secretary of the Belfast Committee for German Refugees, which received Oskar in 1938. There was a Jewish committee receiving refugees. There was a German committee. Some mostly went through the Jewish ones, but some went through the German ones. In 1938, when he came over, it led to their friendship and subsequent marriage. But Honor had traveled to Germany in 1932 for several years, just before Hitler came to power. So she was actually there before and after. She took classes in German and art. She spoke pretty fluent German. And all this was discovered by an interview in the Castlereagh Courier by some very adept librarians who I'll mention later, in February 1983. She also authored some books, one about W.C. Carey, who's a well-known local artist who was a neighbour of hers, which some people may have heard of. Anyhow, Oskar continued on with teaching after uni. He was a temporary wartime teacher in Newton Ards, and then carried on some time in the Belfast Royal Academy, and ended up as being head of the classics department at Annandale Grammar School. But he said in 1970, I was a teacher for 13 years. I'm now a managing director. Of all the jobs done in my life, a lawyer, a farm labourer, a school teacher, and a company director, I consider the teacher's job to have been the toughest and most exacting. Naturalised in 1947. And then Honor, in her interview published in the Castlereagh Chronicle, which is now a defunct newspaper, he later became a businessman when a refugee friend of his, who was Max First, also from Berlin, invited him into partnership at Orlo Leather Goods. And here we have a letterhead from Orlo Leather Goods, 1943, before Oskar had actually joined. They made fancy watch straps. Interesting, the directors, they noted here in the letterhead, they were German refugees. I don't know if that was mandatory or not, but anyhow, something that would be interesting to find out a bit more about. Orlo Leather Goods, Joy Street, later Northumberland Street in Belfast Centre. They were industry stands at industrial fairs. Here are some adverts from the company. This was when they were in Joy Street. This is when they were in Northumberland Street. High quality watch straps. And here are some actual watch straps. They've got this quite interesting, nice little crocodile logo. And Oskar was a designer of watch straps. Again, music was very important to me. He was a very competent violinist. And his first recording we have is 1938 when he was mentioned. Again, not the first year he came over. He was playing with Heinz Hammerschlag in a refugee club in 1941 at Queen's, the Performers Club, also with Joy Foster at the time, who Heinz later married. And it was noted Belfast musicians have for a long time considered themselves inferior to artists anywhere, but refugee musicians have been amazed at the wealth of talent there is here. So very complimentary for the local musicians. Quite a nice little review here in 1952, the Belfast Telegraph, by a concert, a trio played by Rudnitzky, Heinz Hammerschlag, and someone else. This was a trying work for players and listeners alike. Anyhow, some more concerts he played, again, very often with Heinz Hammerschlag. They were very good friends as well. Oskar founded a studio string orchestra in Killaloe, and later became a studio symphony orchestra, is now ongoing. And in 1983, he was the only original member still playing in it. Getting near the end here, so he made his international mark in a letter to the Musical Times in 1980, a very technical discussion whether a repeat sign in Schubert's string quartet in C had been accidentally misplaced, either by Schubert or by the music printers. And Oskar suggested a solution. Anyhow, his solution is quite technical. If anyone wants to follow up the letter, there's the reference. I could understand very little of it. His conclusion was accepted by Hudi Menyon, among other musical maestros, and Newtownards, County Down, is now on the world musical map. He died peacefully in 2005 at home in his 98th year, with children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, obviously very well settled in Northern Ireland. So as well as acknowledging thanks to the PRONI archive for a lot of stuff that we showed, also to the senior librarian in Downpatrick Library and the librarian at the Belfast Central Library, who found these articles, interviews with from Oskar Rudnitzky in the Castlereagh Courier and Newtownards Chronicle, two papers which are not really widely available in archive form. And they said themselves, this highlights the importance of libraries and old-fashioned library reference work. And I certainly can't disagree with that. Anyhow, to finish up, all these people were driven from their home countries, came as refugees to Northern Ireland, a place with a very different language and culture. They all managed to start again in respective fields, and they added significantly to the industry and arts of Northern Ireland, and that their fates could have been indeed very, very different. There's very difficult times we're living in the world at the moment now, and perhaps if we can get even a crumb of comfort from some of these refugee stories that didn't end in tragedy. So if I can finish there, thank you all very much. Not sure if there's much time for Q&A, but if I'll pass back to Stephen.